Hello and welcome. Before we begin our long journey tonight, a journey that will take us across thousands of years of human memory, across deserts and rivers, across the slow rise and fall of cities now buried in sand, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoy our time together, please take a moment to like this video, to subscribe if you haven't already, and to write in the comments where in the world you are listening from. I always love reading those answers, it feels, as though, even while speaking about civilizations long gone, we are creating our own small, connected community in the present. Tell me, are you in a quiet bedroom in the city, the distant hum of traffic in your ears? Or are you in the countryside, perhaps near a window open to the night air, with the faint smell of rain on the fields? Wherever you are, let's allow that space around you to grow still and gentle so that your mind can sink into the slow, unhurried current of history. Tonight, we will drift into the ancient world, into a land some call the cradle of civilization, a place where human beings first shaped the rhythms of life we still know today: government, writing, the law, the wheel, the first recorded stories. This is Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. But we won't rush. We will not leap to kings and empires immediately. Instead, we will begin far back, in the dim light before history, when the rivers carved their paths across the fertile plain and human beings were still learning how to live in one place for more than a season. Imagine a landscape where the earth is dark and rich from centuries of flooding, where reeds grow thick along the banks, and where, in the distance, the land fades into dry steppe and desert. In this place, perhaps 12,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers began to notice that seeds dropped near their campfires would sprout the following year, that certain patches of ground could be coaxed into giving food again and again. This was the slow dawn of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, and it changed everything. Villages began to appear, simple clusters of mud brick houses with flat roofs where grain could be dried. People learned to store surplus harvests, which meant they could survive lean seasons. Surplus also meant trade: baskets of barley, jars of dates, woven cloth carried along dusty paths to other settlements. With this came new skills: pottery to store grain, irrigation channels to control the rivers, the first tentative steps toward organized society. Over centuries, these small villages grew in complexity. The rivers were both a blessing and a challenge. Their floods brought fertility, but they could also destroy crops and homes. Cooperation was essential, and with cooperation came leaders, councils, perhaps the earliest forms of governance. Religion took root here, as well: shrines, where people left offerings to unseen powers they believed controlled the floods, the sun, the fertility of the fields. The night sky, vast and unpolluted, was a map of divine messages to them. They began to track the movement of stars, not only to guide planting, but to understand their place in the universe. This is how the first threads of Mesopotamian identity were woven, threads that would, in time, bind together the great cities of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. And yet, in this first moment of our journey, there are no kings yet, no wars of empire, only people learning, season after season, how to live with the rivers, how to trust the earth to provide, and how to honor the mysterious forces that seem to shape their fate. As centuries passed, the scattered villages of the southern Mesopotamian plain began to draw closer in both proximity and shared culture. The land was so fertile, so full of promise, that it invited human ambition to grow along with the crops. The rivers were tamed with more complex irrigation systems, networks of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, all maintained through collective labor. This was not work for one family or even one village. It required entire communities to coordinate their efforts. Out of this necessity emerged the first signs of central authority leaders who could organize workers, settle disputes over water, and ensure that the network stayed functional year after year. By around 4000 BCE, some of these villages had expanded into what we can now call towns, and soon into the first true cities in human history. One of the most remarkable features of these early urban centers was the temple complex, often dominating the heart of the settlement. Built upon raised platforms of mud brick, these temples, or ziggurats in their later form, were not merely places of worship, they were administrative hubs, storehouses for surplus grain, and symbols of both earthly and divine power. Priests, rather than kings, were the first to hold authority here, for it was believed that they acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods who controlled the floods and the fertility of the fields. In cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, religion, governance, and economics were intertwined. The temple staff managed the distribution of food, oversaw construction projects, and maintained trade relationships with distant settlements. Artisans clustered near these centers, producing goods of clay, metal, and stone, while merchants carried them out along the rivers or overland trade routes. Slowly, the outlines of a civilization began to take shape, a civilization rooted in the cooperation of many, the careful management of resources, and the belief that all prosperity flowed from the favor of the gods. It was here, in Uruk, that one of humanity's most profound innovations was born: writing. At first, it was simple, a system of clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. Over time, these tokens evolved into markings pressed into wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. This was cuneiform, the world's first known written script, and its earliest use was not to record poetry or philosophy, but to keep track of grain, livestock, and labor. Yet this practical tool would soon become something far greater, a way to record myths, laws, and the very memory of the people who shaped Mesopotamia. The rise of writing changed the relationship between generations. No longer did knowledge rely solely on memory and oral tradition. It could be preserved, expanded, and passed down unchanged. As cities grew, so too did their ambitions. Canals reached farther, trade expanded in scope, and the social hierarchy became more defined. Farmers, artisans, merchants, priests, and laborers all had their place in the delicate balance of the city's life. And somewhere within this emerging order, the seeds of kingship were sown, not yet the great empires of later centuries, but the idea that one figure could embody the unity and strength of an entire city. For now, the gods were the ultimate rulers, but the human hand on the plow, the stylus, and the building stone was beginning to imagine a future where mortal ambition could stand alongside divine will. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the land of southern Mesopotamia was a mosaic of city-states, each a self-contained world of walls, fields, temples, and bustling markets. These were the cities of Sumer, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, names that still echo through the corridors of history. Each city was surrounded by a patchwork of farmland nourished by the rivers, and each possessed its own patron deity, whose temple formed the spiritual and administrative heart of the community. Life here was defined by a balance between cooperation and rivalry. The irrigation systems that kept the fields fertile demanded shared labor and careful coordination, yet the cities often competed fiercely for territory, trade routes, and prestige. In times of peace, merchants moved freely between them, carrying jars of oil, sacks of barley, fine textiles, and precious metals from distant lands. In times of conflict, armies marched along the levees and through the dusty plains, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the sun. Kingship, once a temporary role assumed during times of crisis, had by now become permanent, hereditary. The Lugal, literally big man, was both warrior and administrator, expected to defend the city from enemies, oversee construction of temples and canals, and ensure the favor of the gods through elaborate rituals and offerings. The king's power, however, was never absolute. It was bound by tradition, the influence of the priesthood, and the will of the city's assembly of elders. It was in this period that the Sumerians began recording not only their harvests and transactions, but also their stories, the myths that explained their world, and the epics that celebrated their heroes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on clay tablets, told of a mighty king of Uruk whose quest for immortality mirrored humanity's own longing to transcend the limits of life. These stories reveal a people deeply attuned to the cycles of nature, aware of the fragility of life along unpredictable rivers, and conscious of their place in a vast cosmos ruled by capricious gods. Society itself was layered and precise. At the top stood the royal family and high priests, followed by wealthy landowners and merchants. Skilled artisans, potters, metalworkers, weavers formed the backbone of urban craft, while farmers and laborers tended the fields and maintained the canals. Slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, occupied the lowest rung, their lives tied to the households or temples they served. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences, each with a specific domain. Inanna, goddess of love and war. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters. Utu, god of the sun and justice. Daily rituals in the temples, seasonal festivals, and offerings of food and drink were all part of maintaining the delicate balance between the human and divine realms. To neglect the gods was to invite disaster, failed harvests, floods, invasions. Yet despite the dangers of their environment, the people of Sumer thrived, innovating in ways that would shape the course of civilization. They perfected the potter's wheel, advanced metallurgy, and refined their writing into a tool not just of accounting, but of administration, diplomacy, and culture. And as their cities flourished, they began to look beyond their walls, toward the broader lands of Mesopotamia, where other peoples and powers were beginning to stir. The stage was set for the next great chapter in the history of this ancient land, a chapter of unification, ambition, and empire. The unification of Mesopotamia under a single power was not inevitable. For centuries, the Sumerian city-states had thrived in their independence, bound together by a shared culture, yet divided by local rivalries. But in the mid-24th century BCE, a man named Sargon would emerge from the northern region of Akkad to change the political landscape forever. Little is certain about his early life, but the legends are vivid. The story tells of an infant placed in a basket of reeds, set afloat on the Euphrates, and found by a gardener who raised him in the court of a king. Whether true or not, this origin myth speaks to the profound shift. Sargon represented a ruler who rose not from the entrenched dynasties of Sumer, but from the margins, carrying with him both ambition and military genius. Akkad itself was less urbanized than Sumer, but it sat at a crossroads of trade routes, linking the southern cities to lands further north and west. Under Sargon's leadership, the Akkadians adopted much from Sumerian culture, its writing, its religion, its administrative systems, but they wielded it with a new, expansive vision. His conquests began with Kish, a powerful city-state, and quickly spread to Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and beyond. Within a few years, Sargon's armies controlled a vast stretch of territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This was more than mere domination. It was the first known empire in recorded history, held together by a central administration that imposed Akkadian as the official language. For the first time, the cities of Mesopotamia were not merely neighbors or rivals, they were parts of a single political entity, bound to the will of one ruler. The scale of this achievement required innovations in governance. Sargon appointed loyal governors, often drawn from his family, to oversee distant cities. He maintained a standing army, paid directly from the central treasury, capable of responding to threats across the empire. Tribute and taxes flowed toward the capital, funding monumental building projects and ensuring the loyalty of those whose fortunes now depended on imperial stability. Yet empire brought new challenges. Sargon's reign faced rebellions, droughts, and the logistical strain of holding together such a vast and diverse land. The Akkadians, though dominant, had to balance their authority with respect for local traditions, particularly the deep-rooted religious customs of the Sumerians. Temples continued to function as centers of spiritual and economic life, and the gods of each city retained their importance. Still, subtle shifts were underway. Royal inscriptions began to portray the king not merely as a servant of the gods, but as chosen by them an earthly embodiment of divine favor, whose victories in battle were signs of cosmic approval. Sargon's long reign, lasting more than 5 decades, laid the foundation for centuries of imperial ambition in Mesopotamia. His successors, most notably his grandson Naram-Sin, would push these ideas further, carving their names into the mountains and declaring themselves kings of the 4 quarters, rulers of all that lay under the sun. But with such expansion came fragility. The unity Sargon forged would prove difficult to maintain, and the forces of nature and human ambition alike would soon test the strength of the Akkadian experiment. At its height under Sargon's successors, the Akkadian Empire was not just a political creation but a cultural bridge. Trade networks extended far beyond Mesopotamia, reaching Anatolia for silver, the Levant for timber, and distant lands for copper, tin, and precious stones. Merchants traveled in caravans and riverboats, carrying goods, languages, and ideas across vast distances. The imperial capital, though its exact location remains uncertain, would have been a cosmopolitan hub, scribes recording transactions in Akkadian cuneiform, foreign envoys waiting in audience halls, artisans from conquered lands bringing their own styles and techniques. This fusion of cultures enriched the empire, but it also introduced tensions. Local rulers resented their diminished autonomy, and in the far reaches of the empire, loyalty could not always be guaranteed. Under Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon, the Akkadian state reached a peak of both ambition and self-image. His reign was marked by grand military campaigns, not only against neighboring city-states, but also against powerful coalitions of mountain tribes and foreign kingdoms. Victories were immortalized in monumental reliefs, the most famous depicting the king striding up a mountainside, trampling his enemies underfoot, wearing the horned crown that traditionally belonged only to the gods. This was a profound shift in royal ideology. Naram-Sin openly claimed divine status, portraying himself not just as chosen by the gods but as one of them. Such assertions brought prestige and fear, but also controversy, especially among the deeply religious Sumerians who viewed the gods as supreme and distant. Yet, even a ruler who saw himself as divine could not control the forces that were about to undo his empire. Toward the end of the 23rd century BCE, a combination of environmental and political crises began to erode Akkadian power. Archaeological evidence suggests a prolonged drought struck the region, reducing agricultural yields and creating famine. With less food to support both the population and the army, unrest grew. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, began raiding into Akkadian territory, exploiting the weakening state. Internal rebellions flared in key cities, and the logistical network that had bound the empire together began to fray. Naram-Sin's successors lacked his charisma and authority. One by one, cities broke away, either falling under Gutian influence or reasserting their independence. The once mighty Akkadian Empire, the first of its kind, collapsed within a generation, leaving behind a fragmented landscape of city-states. Yet its legacy endured. The Akkadian language remained a dominant tongue for centuries, used in administration, literature, and diplomacy. The very concept of empire, the idea that a single ruler could unite diverse peoples under a central authority, would inspire future kings across Mesopotamia and beyond. The ruins of Akkad, now lost to history, became a symbol of both ambition and impermanence, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations are subject to the cycles of rise and fall. In the aftermath of the Akkadian collapse, Mesopotamia entered a period of fragmentation and uncertainty. The Gutians, those elusive mountain dwellers from the Zagros, established a loose dominance over much of the region, but they lacked the administrative sophistication to maintain a centralized state. Contemporary Sumerian texts often portray them as a destructive force, barbarians uninterested in the cultivation of the land, allowing irrigation systems to fall into disrepair, temples to crumble, and urban life to wither. Whether these depictions were entirely accurate or a product of political propaganda, there is little doubt that the era was one of decline. Agricultural output diminished, long-distance trade slowed, and the cultural vibrancy of the cities dimmed. Yet, even in this period of hardship, the resilience of the Sumerian city-states endured. Slowly, pockets of recovery began to emerge, led by cities that had preserved some measure of stability and resources. Among these, the city of Uruk regained prominence, as did the sacred city of Nippur, whose religious authority gave it influence beyond its military strength. It was in this context, toward the close of the 22nd century BCE, that a remarkable resurgence began to take shape in the city of Ur. Under the leadership of Ur-Nammu, the founder of what historians now call the Third Dynasty of Ur, Mesopotamia experienced what can only be described as a renaissance. Ur-Nammu's reign marked the beginning of the Neo-Sumerian period, a time when the ideals of Sumerian culture were revived and refined. The new rulers did not attempt to erase the memory of the Akkadian Empire. Instead, they absorbed its lessons, adopting centralized administrative practices while grounding their authority firmly in traditional Sumerian religious and cultural frameworks. One of Ur-Nammu's most enduring legacies was his legal code, among the earliest known in human history. Inscribed on clay tablets, it sought to establish justice through fixed penalties for specific offenses, a significant step toward codified law. His building projects were equally ambitious. Temples and ziggurats rose from the plains, constructed with baked brick and adorned with elaborate inscriptions dedicating them to the gods. The ziggurat of Ur, in particular, stood as a towering testament to the city's renewed prosperity and religious devotion. Economic life revived as irrigation canals were restored, farmland reclaimed, and trade networks re-established. Artisans returned to their workshops, producing fine jewelry, intricately carved cylinder seals, and vividly painted pottery. Scribes once again filled clay tablets with administrative records, hymns, and literary works, preserving the cultural heritage that had endured through centuries of upheaval. The Neo-Sumerian kings, though powerful, recognized the necessity of cooperation among the cities. Governors were appointed to oversee distant regions, but religious festivals and temple patrona helped bind the disparate parts of the realm together in a shared cultural identity. For a generation, peace and order returned to Mesopotamia, and the memory of past chaos began to fade. Yet, as history would show time and again, stability in this land was never permanent. Forces beyond the horizon were already gathering new peoples, new ambitions that would once more reshape the destiny of the land between the rivers. The Third Dynasty of Ur, often simply called Ur III, stands in history as both a pinnacle of Sumerian achievement and a final flowering before the culture's political independence faded forever. Founded by Ur-Nammu around 2112 BCE, the dynasty projected its authority over most of Mesopotamia, weaving together a network of cities, farmlands, and trade routes under a carefully organized administrative system. Unlike the looser structures of earlier empires, Ur III governance reached deeply into the daily life of its subjects. From the central capital at Ur, a bureaucracy of scribes and officials managed everything from irrigation schedules to tax collection. The records they kept, etched in cuneiform onto tens of thousands of clay tablets, survive in astonishing abundance, giving modern historians a uniquely detailed view of life at the time. Grain yields, livestock numbers, labor assignments, and temple offerings were all meticulously recorded, reflecting a state that sought to account for every measure of wealth and resource. At the heart of Ur's authority was the image of the king as a shepherd, a traditional Sumerian metaphor, but now intertwined with a vision of near-divine stewardship. The king was seen as the chosen intermediary between the gods and the people, responsible for maintaining order, justice, and the favor of the divine realm. Ur-Nammu's building projects reflected this ideology. The Grand Ziggurat of Ur, a stepped temple platform dedicated to the moon god Nana, rose above the city like a man-made mountain. Its baked brick walls, faced with bitumen and gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, would have been visible for miles across the flat plain. The ziggurat was not merely an architectural wonder. It was a symbolic axis mundi, a bridge between heaven and earth where priests could ascend toward the realm of the gods. Alongside such monumental works, the dynasty invested in infrastructure essential for sustaining its power. Canals were dredged and extended, linking distant fields to the great rivers and ensuring stable irrigation. Roads and way stations facilitated the movement of goods and officials. Artisans in Ur produced luxury goods in lapis lazuli, gold, and silver, much of it destined for elite households and temple treasuries. The city's harbor bustled with trade, drawing goods from as far as the Indus Valley and the Persian Gulf. Yet this prosperity was not without cost. The administrative reach of the state demanded labor, and while free citizens contributed as part of their obligations, a significant portion of the workforce consisted of bound laborers and war captives. These people toiled in the fields, on construction projects, and in temple workshops, their efforts underwriting the grandeur of the dynasty. Social hierarchy was rigid, but religious life provided moments of collective identity that crossed class boundaries. Festivals in honor of Nana, Inanna, Enlil, and other gods brought the population together in processions, music, and offerings. Priests and priestesses, often drawn from elite families, played prominent roles not only in ritual, but in the economic management of temple estates. For several decades, this system produced stability, cultural vitality, and a sense of unity rare in Mesopotamian history. But beyond the city walls, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. To the east, the Elamites were growing stronger, consolidating power in the highlands of southwestern Iran. To the northwest, Amorite tribes were moving steadily into Mesopotamian lands, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes as settlers, and sometimes as raiders. The balance that Ur-Nammu and his successors had achieved was fragile, and as the century turned, the forces that had once brought prosperity would begin to strain under the weight of external pressure and internal complexity. The reign of Shulgi, son of Ur-Nammu, marked the zenith of the third dynasty of Ur. Ascending to the throne after his father's death, Shulgi ruled for an extraordinary 48 years, a span that allowed him to consolidate and expand upon the foundations laid before him. His reputation in surviving inscriptions is one of almost superhuman energy. He claimed to be a swift runner, a learned scholar, a patron of the arts, and a pious servant of the gods. Whether all his boasts were literal truth or political propaganda, the effect was the same. Shulgi embodied the ideal of the Sumerian king in both strength and wisdom. His reign saw the bureaucracy of Ur grow to an unprecedented level of sophistication. Standardized measurements, fixed tax quotas, and a unified system of weights and measures allowed for smoother administration across the diverse territories under Ur's control. Regional governors, or ensi, reported directly to the central government, while a hierarchy of lesser officials ensured that resources flowed reliably toward the capital. The archive tablets from this era reveal a web of economic planning that covered everything from the distribution of beer rations to temple singers to the allocation of draft animals for seasonal plowing. Shulgi also invested in infrastructure that stitched the empire together. The Royal Road, connecting key cities, was improved and patrolled, making it safer for merchants and messengers. Rest houses were built at regular intervals, each provisioned for travelers and officials, a network that spoke to the logistical vision of the king. Cultural life thrived under Shulgi's patronage. He promoted scribal education, ensuring that cuneiform literacy remained a hallmark of administrative and elite life. Hymns and royal inscriptions from his reign depict him as both warrior and scholar, blending martial valor with literary refinement. Temples continued to rise, and the ziggurat of Ur was further embellished with glazed brickwork and ritual stairways. Yet even as Shulgi strengthened the internal coherence of his realm, the external threats that had been looming grew more pronounced. The Elamites to the east were increasingly organized and aggressive. The Amorites, semi-nomadic tribes from the west, pushed deeper into Mesopotamia, sometimes settling peacefully but often clashing with local powers. To counter these pressures, Shulgi fortified the empire's borders. He constructed a massive defensive wall in the north, known in later records as the Wall of the Land, stretching for miles across the steppe. Its purpose was to keep out Amorite incursions, but like so many monumental defenses in history, it proved as much a psychological barrier as a physical one. Within the heartland, Shulgi maintained control through both benevolence and firmness. He granted lavish offerings to temples, distributed grain in times of shortage, and presided over grand festivals that reinforced the unity of the realm. But he also punished rebellion swiftly, dispatching military expeditions to suppress disloyal governors or raiding tribes. Toward the end of his reign, the strains on the empire began to show. Maintaining such a vast and intricately managed state required constant oversight, and even with Shulgi's energy, cracks appeared. Border regions grew restless, garrisons were stretched thin, and the cost of military campaigns mounted. Still, by the time of his death, the third dynasty of remained intact, its cities prosperous, its temples resplendent, and its reputation unmatched in Mesopotamia. Shulgi had preserved his father's legacy and, for a time, made the unrivaled heart of the ancient Near East. But his successors would inherit not only the glory, but also the vulnerabilities he left behind. Vulnerabilities that would soon become impossible to ignore. The successors of Shulgi, Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin each inherited an empire that, while still formidable, was beginning to bend under the weight of its own ambitions. Amarsin, Shulgi's immediate heir, ruled for 9 years and sought to continue his father's program of construction and consolidation. He is remembered for repairing and extending the great ziggurat of as well as for commissioning temples in other major cities, such as Nippur and Uruk. His reign also saw ongoing military campaigns against the Elamites, who remained an ever-present threat to the east. Amarsin's records reveal frequent expeditions into Elamite territory, sometimes punitive in nature, aimed at discouraging raids and demonstrating Ur's military reach. But the costs of these campaigns were considerable, draining the treasury and stretching the logistical capabilities of the administration. Following Amarsin's death, his brother Shusin ascended the throne. His rule lasted nearly a decade and is marked by one of the most ambitious defensive undertakings in Mesopotamian history. The construction of an enormous wall stretching for dozens of miles across the northern frontier, designed to keep out the Amorites. Known in later records as the Amorite Wall, it was both a statement of Ur's determination to defend its borders and a tacit acknowledgement that the pressure from migrating tribes had reached a critical point. Despite this monumental effort, the wall could not be manned effectively along its entire length, and determined groups of Amorites often found ways around it. Shusin's reign also reveals signs of economic strain. The elaborate bureaucracy, so effective under Shulgi, began to falter as officials faced shortages, delayed deliveries, and increasing corruption. Grain stores in some provinces failed to meet quotas, and complaints from local administrators became more frequent. By the time Ibisin, the last king of III, came to power, the empire was a patchwork of loyalty and unrest. Ibisin's reign was plagued by a series of crises, natural, economic, and political. A devastating drought struck during his time, leading to widespread famine. The once prosperous farmlands along the rivers produced meager harvests, and with less surplus to store, the state's ability to feed its people and its armies collapsed. This environmental hardship coincided with intensified incursions by both Elamites and Amorites, who exploited the weakened defenses to raid deep into Mesopotamian territory. As provinces fell away from central control, itself became increasingly isolated. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows Ibisin pleading with governors and allies to send aid, but his appeals often went unanswered. In the empire's final years, Elamite forces launched a decisive invasion, capturing the city of The sack of Ur was a catastrophe recorded with deep sorrow in Sumerian lamentations, poetic compositions that mourn not just the destruction of a city, but the end of an era. Temples were desecrated, the great ziggurat damaged, treasures looted, and the population subjected to slaughter or enslavement. Ibisen himself was taken prisoner and exiled to Elam, where he died in captivity. With his fall, the third dynasty of Ur vanished from the political map, its territories divided among rival powers. In the wake of Ur's collapse, the cultural and linguistic identity of Sumer continued, but the political dominance of Sumerian kingship was gone. The Amorites would rise to power in Babylon. The Elamites would assert themselves in the east, and a new chapter in Mesopotamian history would begin, one in which the echoes of Sumer's grandeur persisted in law codes, literature, and the enduring image of the king as shepherd of his people. For later generations, the memory of Ur-3 was both an inspiration and a warning, a vision of order, prosperity, and cultural achievement, but also a reminder of how even the most carefully built empires can be undone by the converging forces of nature, human ambition, and time itself. In the aftermath of Ur's fall, the political landscape of Mesopotamia fractured into a patchwork of city-states, each vying for power in the shadow of the once great Sumerian Empire. The vacuum left by the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur invited both opportunity and chaos. Into this shifting arena stepped the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who had long lived on the peripheries of Mesopotamian civilization. Once dismissed by the Sumerians as uncultured nomads, the Amorites now proved themselves formidable political actors. Many settled in existing cities, integrating into local society while gradually assuming positions of influence. Over time, Amorite leaders began to establish dynasties in key city-states, most notably in Isin, Larsa, and eventually Babylon. The Isin-Larsa period, as it came to be known, was a time of both rivalry and cultural continuity. The rulers of Isin claimed the mantle of Ur's legacy, presenting themselves as guardians of Sumerian tradition. They maintained the use of Sumerian in official inscriptions, upheld religious rituals, and preserved the administrative practices that had defined the Ur-3 bureaucracy. Yet they faced constant competition from Larsa, whose kings proved adept at exploiting trade routes and forging alliances. The rivalry between Isin and Larsa was not merely military, it was also a contest for legitimacy. Control over sacred cities like Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, could bolster a ruler's claims to universal kingship. As the two powers sparred, they were also engaged in a wider struggle against Elamite incursions from the east and the lingering threat of tribal raids from the west. During this period, another city began to rise from relative obscurity: Babylon. Situated strategically along the Euphrates, Babylon benefited from the shifting trade patterns of the time. Initially a minor Amorite-led kingdom, Babylon's fortunes began to change as its rulers consolidated control over surrounding territories and invested in fortifications, canals, and temples. Though still overshadowed by Isin and Larsa in the early stages, Babylon's growing influence hinted at the future. Daily life in Mesopotamia during this era retained many familiar rhythms despite the political turbulence. Farmers continued to rely on irrigation to coax crops from the fertile but unpredictable soil. Merchants plied the rivers and caravan routes, trading grain, wool, and pottery for timber, metals, and precious stones from distant lands. Temples remained central to community life, serving not only as places of worship but as economic hubs where goods were stored, loans were issued, and labor was organized. Yet the sense of vulnerability was never far from the surface. The memory of Ur's destruction lingered, shaping the decisions of kings and commoners alike. Fortifications were built higher, alliances were forged with greater caution, and omens were read with anxious attention. In literature, the laments for Ur and other fallen cities were copied and preserved. Their mournful verses, a reminder that divine favor could be as fleeting as the spring floods. The political map of Mesopotamia in this period was in constant flux. Borders shifted with each campaign, and a city's fortunes could rise or fall in a single season. Into this volatile mix, new leaders emerged, figures whose ambition and vision would eventually reshape the region. Among them was a king of Babylon, whose name would become synonymous with law, power, and empire, Hammurabi. But before his ascent, the stage had to be set by decades of maneuvering, conflict, and the slow accumulation of strength by those Amorite dynasties that had once been dismissed as outsiders. The path to Babylon's dominance was neither swift nor straightforward. In the early decades of the 18th century BCE, the city was still a modest player in the intricate web of Mesopotamian politics, overshadowed by the larger and more established kingdoms of Larsa, Eshnunna, and Meri. Yet its kings understood the art of gradual expansion. They began by securing the immediate hinterlands, fortifying the city's walls, and improving the canal systems that ensured both agricultural productivity and ease of movement for troops. Trade became a cornerstone of Babylon's strategy. Its location along the Euphrates allowed goods to flow in from the north and south, bringing prosperity to the markets and filling the royal treasury. By controlling stretches of the river and key caravan routes, Babylon positioned itself as a hub for the exchange of grain, wool, dates, and artisan goods for metals, timber, and luxury items from regions as far afield as Anatolia and the Indus Valley. But economic power alone could not secure Babylon's future. The kings recognized the need to navigate the volatile network of alliances and rivalries that defined Mesopotamian politics. At times, this meant forging pacts with stronger neighbors. At others, it meant playing rivals against one another. The early Babylonian kings were adept at identifying moments of weakness in their opponents and exploiting them, capturing towns, securing trade posts, and slowly extending their influence. It was against this backdrop that Hammurabi ascended to the throne around 1792 BCE. He inherited a city that was stronger than it had been a generation earlier, but still vulnerable to the shifting tides of regional power. Hammurabi's reign began cautiously, marked by diplomatic overtures and measured military campaigns. He avoided direct confrontation with the most powerful states, focusing instead on consolidating Babylon's hold over nearby territories. The young king also invested heavily in public works, repairing temples, improving irrigation, and ensuring that the gods of Babylon were honored with lavish offerings. These acts not only secured divine favor in the eyes of his subjects, but also reinforced the legitimacy of his rule. Over time, Hammurabi's patience paid off. Political fractures began to appear among his rivals. In Larsa, succession disputes weakened the throne. In Mari, internal strife eroded unity. In Eshnunna, shifting alliances left it exposed. Hammurabi seized each opportunity with precision. Campaigns were launched not recklessly but with careful timing, often after diplomatic groundwork had been laid to isolate his targets. The king's reputation grew not merely as a warrior, but as a master strategist who understood the long game of empire building. As Babylon expanded, Hammurabi turned his attention to unifying his territories under a coherent system of governance. The vast and diverse lands now under his control required more than military presence. They needed a legal and administrative framework that could bind them together. This necessity would lead to the creation of one of the most enduring legacies in world history, the Code of Hammurabi. Yet before that monumental achievement could take shape, Hammurabi would have to navigate years of warfare, diplomacy, and internal reform. The unification of Mesopotamia under Babylon was not the work of a single campaign, but the culmination of decades of calculated moves, a slow tightening of the net until Babylon stood as the unrivaled power in the land between the rivers. The decisive phase of Hammurabi's reign unfolded over a span of years marked by relentless campaigning and deft diplomacy. By the mid-18th century BCE, the king had strengthened Babylon's position to the point where it could challenge the great powers directly. His first major target was Larsa, a wealthy city-state whose control of southern trade routes and fertile agricultural lands made it a persistent rival. Larsa's ruler, Rim-Sin, had enjoyed decades of dominance, but by this time his power was waning. Internal dissent, the erosion of key alliances, and the gradual encirclement by Hammurabi's forces all combined to weaken him. Hammurabi bided his time, securing agreements with neighboring powers to ensure that Larsa would stand alone when the final blow came. When he struck, it was with overwhelming force. Babylonian armies, well organized and supplied through a network of canals and depots, advanced swiftly. Cities loyal to Larsa fell one by one, their rulers either replaced by Babylonian governors or integrated into the new administrative structure. When Larsa itself finally capitulated, it marked a turning point. Southern Mesopotamia was now firmly under Babylonian control. But Hammurabi's ambitions did not end there. To the north and east, the cities of Eshnunna and Mari represented both opportunity and threat. Eshnunna controlled key routes into the Zagros Mountains and maintained strong ties with eastern kingdoms. Mari, located further up the Euphrates, was a hub for trade with the Levant and Anatolia, and its king, Zimri-Lim, was both an ally and a rival to Hammurabi. For years, the relationship between Babylon and Mari had been maintained through a delicate balance of mutual benefit, but the shifting alliances of the time made such arrangements fragile. When Hammurabi saw that Mari's influence was faltering and that Zimri-Lim's attention was divided by external threats, he moved decisively. Babylonian forces swept into Mari, capturing the city and bringing its vast archives into Babylon's possession. These archives, filled with diplomatic correspondence, trade records, and religious texts, would later provide historians with an unparalleled window into the workings of ancient diplomacy and governance. With Mari subdued and Eshnunna brought to heel, Hammurabi stood at the pinnacle of his power. The lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, from the Persian Gulf to the fringes of the Levant, were unified under his rule. Yet the challenge of ruling such a diverse and expansive territory required more than military might. The peoples of these lands spoke different languages, followed different customs, and worshipped different gods. To create a lasting unity, Hammurabi needed a shared framework of order, a system that would apply equally to farmer and merchant, noble and commoner. This was the context in which the Code of Hammurabi emerged, not as an abstract philosophical exercise, but as a practical tool of governance. Inscribed on a massive basalt stele and placed in a public space, the code proclaimed its principles for all to see. It addressed matters as varied as property rights, trade regulations, marriage, inheritance, and criminal justice. While some of its provisions reflected the harsh realities of the time, the very act of codifying laws was revolutionary. It signaled that justice was not solely at the whim of the ruler, but was grounded in a set of established norms. In this way, Hammurabi's conquests were not merely about expanding territory. They were about building an enduring political order, one that would shape Mesopotamia for generations and leave a legacy studied and debated to this day. The Code of Hammurabi stands today as one of the most famous artifacts from the ancient world, not simply because it survives on a tall basalt stele now housed in the Louvre, but because it represents an early attempt to create a unified vision of justice for a diverse empire. Standing over 2 meters tall, the stone is crowned by a striking relief. Hammurabi himself receiving the laws from Shamash, the Mesopotamian god of the sun and justice. The image was not merely decorative, it was a declaration that the laws inscribed below were divinely sanctioned, and that to obey them was to honor both the king and the gods. The text beneath is written in the Akkadian language, using cuneiform script carefully carved by skilled scribes. It contains nearly 300 distinct laws, organized into thematic sections that range from family matters to commercial disputes, agricultural regulations, and criminal punishments. The code was not intended as a philosophical treatise, but as a working legal manual. In marketplaces, in temples, and in the courts of Babylon, these laws would be cited as the standard for resolving conflicts. Its scope reflected the complexity of life in a vast empire. In the fields, laws dictated how farmers should maintain irrigation canals, how they should share water with their neighbors, and what penalties awaited them if negligence caused another's crops to fail. In the bustling markets, traders and merchants operated under strict rules governing weights, measures, and credit, ensuring that commerce could flow without descending into chaos. In households, the code regulated marriage contracts, dowries, inheritance, and the rights and duties of spouses. Its treatment of justice was rooted in the principle of retribution, what later legal traditions would call an eye for an eye. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed its owner, the builder himself could be put to death. If a merchant cheated a customer, restitution was demanded, often with additional penalties. Yet the code also recognized social distinctions, applying different penalties depending on the status of the victim and the perpetrator. While this stratification strikes the modern mind as unjust, in Hammurabi's world it was a reflection of the social hierarchy that underpinned the empire. The very act of inscribing the code in stone and placing it in a public space was transformative. In earlier times, the administration of justice often depended on the discretion of local rulers or priests, leaving room for inconsistency and corruption. Hammurabi's code sought to limit such arbitrariness, binding even his own officials to a written standard. People who could not read themselves would still know of its existence, and the scribes and judges who interpreted the code were expected to follow its dictates faithfully. The laws also revealed the values of the society that produced them. The protection of property, the maintenance of family honor, the safeguarding of agricultural productivity, and the regulation of trade all were central concerns. In a land where the fortunes of cities depended on the careful management of water, disputes over irrigation could be as significant as disputes over land or livestock. In this way, the Code of Hammurabi was as much a manual for sustaining the empire as it was a statement on morality. It offered predictability in an unpredictable world, and in doing so, it helped bind together the many peoples who now lived under the banner of Babylon. To truly understand the Code of Hammurabi, one must look beyond its monumental stone and examine the texture of life it sought to regulate. The nearly 300 laws carved into the basalt were not abstract. They were rooted in real disputes, in real fears, in the daily rhythm of a civilization that relied on fragile balances of labor, water, and trust. Take, for example, the laws concerning agriculture, which formed the economic backbone of Mesopotamia. One article decreed that if a farmer neglected to maintain the irrigation canals on his land, and that negligence caused flooding or ruined a neighbor's crops, the farmer was required to compensate the loss in grain. This was not merely about punishing carelessness, it was about protecting the delicate lifeline of the empire, where every channel of water was a shared artery of survival. In another provision, if a man rented an ox for plowing and mistreated it to the point of injury or death, he was obliged to replace it with an ox of equal value. This reflected the high worth placed on draft animals, which were essential for tilling the heavy, clay-rich soils of the river plains. Commerce was equally safeguarded. Babylon's markets were crowded, loud, and complex, with merchants dealing in goods from as far away as the Indus Valley and Anatolia. To prevent fraud, the code established exact standards for weights and measures, and penalties for merchants who tampered with them. In a world without consumer protection laws or official inspectors, such written rules acted as both deterrent and reassurance. Domestic life was another pillar of the code, and its provisions reveal much about Babylonian society. Marriages were formal contracts, often negotiated between families, and the law carefully outlined the rights of both spouses. If a husband wished to divorce his wife without cause, he was required to return her dowry in full, ensuring that she was not left destitute. If a wife was found guilty of neglecting her household or dishonoring her husband, the penalties could be severe, reflecting the deep emphasis on family reputation. The laws also touched on inheritance, specifying how property should be divided among sons, daughters, and other relatives. While daughters generally received less than sons, the code nonetheless provided them with some protection, particularly if they became widows or had no brothers. criminal justice under Hammurabi was harsh by modern standards, often employing physical punishments, exile, or even death. Yet within the context of its time, such penalties were seen as necessary to maintain order in a diverse and sprawling empire. The principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, ensured that punishment was proportional to the crime, though social status could alter the scale. Striking a nobleman, for instance, carried a far heavier penalty than striking a commoner. What emerges from these laws is a portrait of a society deeply concerned with stability, fairness within the accepted hierarchy, and the prevention of chaos. By setting these rules in stone, Hammurabi projected an image of himself as both conqueror and caretaker, a ruler who could wield the sword but preferred the pen when it came to binding his people together. And while many of the specific statutes may seem foreign to us now, the underlying impulse to codify expectations and ensure consistent justice remains familiar, echoing in the legal systems of the modern world. The Code of Hammurabi was more than a set of practical instructions. It was a carefully crafted political and religious statement, a tool of legitimacy in an age when kings needed to be seen not just as warriors, but as moral stewards of their people. The stele's very design conveyed this message. At the top, the carved image of Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the god of the sun and justice, was no idle artistic choice. It was a visual proclamation that every law inscribed beneath was handed down with divine approval. In the minds of ancient Babylonians, to obey the law was not merely to respect the king's authority, it was to remain in harmony with the cosmic order itself. The prologue of the code is almost poetic in its self-presentation. Hammurabi introduces himself not simply as a ruler, but as the shepherd of the people, chosen by the gods Anu and Enlil to bring justice, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, and to enlighten the land with order and peace. These words were deliberately placed before the laws, reminding anyone who read or heard a recitation of the code that this was not a bureaucratic document. It was a sacred trust between ruler, deity, and subject. The epilogue reinforced this divine alignment, declaring blessings upon those who upheld the laws and curses upon those who would alter or ignore them. In a society where religion was woven into every aspect of life, this divine framing gave the code a weight that went beyond mortal enforcement. To defy it was not simply a crime against the state, it was an offense against the gods themselves. This religious aura also strengthened Hammurabi's political position. By positioning himself as the chosen instrument of divine will, he presented his rule as inevitable, even predestined. Rivals could not simply challenge him without appearing to challenge the gods. The code thus became a tool not just for regulating life, but for sustaining the very structure of Babylonian governance. There was also a symbolic dimension to its public display. The stele was not hidden away in a palace, it stood in a prominent location, perhaps in a temple courtyard, where citizens could see it. Most people could not read the dense cuneiform, but the presence of the monument itself, the imagery at its top, and the knowledge that scribes and judges could consult it gave it an almost magical authority. It was a visible promise that law, not whim, would guide the kingdom. This was a profound statement in an era when many rulers relied on personal decree rather than codified rules. Through this combination of legal precision, religious framing, and public symbolism, the Code of Hammurabi became more than a historical artifact, it became an enduring idea. Its survival through millennia, buried beneath the sands until rediscovered in the early 20th century, speaks to the durability of its vision. In its time, it offered the people of Babylon something rare in the ancient world, a sense of predictability, a belief that justice, though shaped by the values and hierarchies of the age, was accessible to all who lived under the shadow of its stone. The reign of Hammurabi marked a high point in the political and cultural life of Babylon, yet even at its zenith, the seeds of change were already sown. Empires, no matter how well governed, are living organisms. They expand, adapt, and inevitably face pressures that test their strength. In the decades following Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian state began to navigate the complex and often dangerous currents of regional politics. The vastness of the empire, which had once been a sign of its power, now posed a challenge. Administrators struggled to maintain consistent control over distant provinces, and while the Code of Hammurabi provided a unified framework for justice, it could not by itself ensure loyalty in lands far from Babylon's heart. Local rulers, appointed as governors, sometimes interpreted the code to suit their own interests, softening its edge for allies, or applying it harshly against rivals. Trade, once the lifeblood of the empire, began to fluctuate. Distant caravans bringing tin from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and fine textiles from the Indus Valley faced increasing dangers: bandit raids, political unrest in neighboring territories, and the unpredictable shifts of climate that could turn fertile stretches into parched expanses. In Mesopotamia itself, the very rivers that had sustained civilization since the dawn of Sumer began to change their courses in subtle but impactful ways. A slight shift in the flow of the Euphrates could alter irrigation networks built over generations, leaving some farmlands dry while flooding others. Such environmental challenges were not new to the region, but as the population grew and agricultural land was stretched to its limits, the margin for error narrowed. Militarily, Babylon faced growing competition. Neighboring powers, some old rivals, others newly risen, watched for signs of weakness. The Kassites to the east, the Hurrians to the north, and the resurgent Assyrians further upriver all represented potential threats. The delicate balance of alliances and rivalries that Hammurabi had managed with skill began to shift after his passing, and without his personal authority to anchor it, Babylon's influence gradually loosened. Within the city itself, life continued with the rhythms of the temple and the marketplace. Priests oversaw rituals in towering ziggurats, scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets, artisans shaped fine jewelry, and carved intricate cylinder seals. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, there was a sense that the empire was no longer marching forward with the same certainty. Political succession, always a point of vulnerability, became a subject of quiet tension in the royal court. While Hammurabi's successors claimed his divine mandate, they lacked his unique blend of charisma, military acumen, and diplomatic subtlety. These subtle changes did not immediately dismantle Babylon's power. Empires rarely collapse overnight, but they began the slow transformation from expansion to preservation, from confident dominance to guarded maintenance. It is in this gradual shift that the next chapters of Mesopotamian history begin to unfold, where new powers would rise, old ones would adapt or fade, and the legacy of Hammurabi's Babylon would be tested against the relentless currents of time. The centuries that followed Hammurabi's reign were marked by a slow but undeniable shift in the balance of power across Mesopotamia. What had once been a firmly centralized kingdom began to face the constant pressure of outside forces and the steady erosion of internal cohesion. The Kassites, a people of uncertain origin but formidable resilience, emerged from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Unlike invaders who came only to plunder, the Kassites sought permanence. They were patient, building influence through small incursions, diplomatic marriages, and the gradual infiltration of Babylon's political and administrative systems. Their presence did not at first appear catastrophic. In fact, early Kassite leaders often adopted Babylonian customs, worshipped Babylonian gods, and presented themselves as protectors of the land. But with each passing decade, their foothold deepened. To the north, the Assyrians were stirring. For centuries, Ashur had been a city-state, occasionally a minor power. But the political fragmentation after Hammurabi's era gave the Assyrians room to expand. They began to project their military strength along the upper Tigris, asserting control over key trade routes and presenting themselves as the rightful heirs to Mesopotamia's imperial tradition. This was not yet the era of the great Neo-Assyrian Empire, but the seeds of that future dominance were being sown in these formative years. Meanwhile, cultural shifts were taking place within Babylon itself. The cosmopolitan nature of the city meant that ideas, languages, and traditions from across the ancient Near East flowed in constantly. Kassite rulers introduced their own customs, blending them with the deeply rooted Sumerian and Akkadian traditions that still shaped law, literature, and religion. This cultural layering enriched Babylon's identity but also diluted the sharp edges of the Hammurabi era, creating a society that was less uniform, more diverse, and some might say less tightly bound by a single vision. Religion continued to play a stabilizing role. The great temples still dominated the skyline, and the ziggurat of Marduk remained the spiritual and symbolic heart of the city. Ritual processions, seasonal festivals, and offerings to the gods reinforced the idea that Babylon was under divine protection, even as political realities shifted. Yet here too, subtle changes emerged. New deities were introduced into the pantheon, some foreign, some adapted from older traditions but given fresh prominence. These changes reflected the evolving demographics of the city, but also hinted at a gradual loosening of the singular religious authority that had underpinned Hammurabi's reign. Militarily, Babylon's defenses were tested repeatedly. Raiders from the western deserts probed its borders, seeking plunder from merchant caravans. Clashes with Elam to the southeast occasionally flared into full-scale conflict. Even when battles were won, the cost in resources, manpower, and political focus was high. In such an environment, the priorities of the state shifted from ambitious expansion to pragmatic survival. Trade endured, though not without disruption. The once flourishing connections to distant regions were now more vulnerable to interruption, and merchants had to navigate an increasingly complex web of local powers to keep their goods moving. The image of Babylon as the unrivaled hub of Mesopotamia was slowly giving way to a more contested reality, one in which it was still a jewel of the region, but no longer the unchallenged master. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, the transformation of Babylon from the seat of Hammurabi's empire into a kingdom under Kassite rule was no longer a gradual process, it was a reality. The Kassites, having established themselves not as conquerors who came and went, but as long-term stewards of the land, redefined what it meant to rule in Mesopotamia. Their reign would last for nearly 4 centuries, making it one of the most enduring dynasties in the region's history. This longevity was due in part to their ability to integrate into the existing cultural fabric. They adopted the Akkadian language for administration, maintained the traditional Babylonian religious system, and preserved the city's status as a sacred center. Yet their presence subtly shifted the balance of identity. While Hammurabi's Babylon had been an empire driven by centralized authority and a cohesive legal code, Kassite Babylon was more of a federation, a loosely bound network of territories where local autonomy was often tolerated in exchange for loyalty and tribute. The Kassites introduced innovations of their own. They reorganized land ownership, granting estates to loyal nobles, soldiers, and even temple officials as a means of rewarding service and ensuring allegiance. They encouraged agriculture by redistributing lands that had fallen into neglect during the political instability of previous decades. These policies, while strengthening rural productivity, also shifted power away from the urban elite toward a landed aristocracy tied directly to the Kassite kings. Babylon during this period remained a vibrant city, its ziggurats still towering, its processional ways still lined with ceremonial gates and richly decorated walls. Festivals such as the New Year's celebration of Akitu continued to draw crowds, reinforcing the city's religious prestige. The Kassite rulers took great care to associate themselves with Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon, ensuring that their rule was framed as a continuation of divine will rather than a foreign imposition. Diplomatically, the Kassites played a shrewd game on the international stage. They maintained correspondence with Egypt during the New Kingdom era, exchanged gifts with the Hittite Empire, and negotiated peace treaties with Elam when necessary. Clay tablets from this period, preserved in the Amarna letters, reveal Babylonian kings engaging in marriage alliances and trade agreements that extended far beyond Mesopotamia. This was a different kind of power, less about military conquest, more about diplomatic positioning. Yet, for all their achievements, the Kassite era was not immune to decline. Over time, the decentralized nature of their governance meant that local rulers grew more independent, and the central authority in Babylon weakened. External threats never disappeared. Elamite armies remained a danger. Assyria's ambitions continued to expand, and tribal incursions from the west periodically disrupted trade and agriculture. By the end of the Kassite dynasty, the once stable system had become brittle. When Elam launched a decisive invasion in the 12th century BCE, Babylon's defenses faltered. The city was sacked, treasures looted, and for a time, Babylon ceased to be the uncontested heart of southern Mesopotamia. Yet, even in defeat, the cultural legacy of the Kassites endured. Their blending of traditions, their long stewardship of the city, and their role in maintaining Babylon's sacred status ensured that the name of Babylon would survive the political upheavals of the centuries to come. The twilight of the Kassite dynasty opened a chapter in Mesopotamian history that was as turbulent as it was transformative. The fall of their long reign did not leave a vacuum for long. In the aftermath of the Elamite sack of Babylon around the 12th century BCE, the city lay humiliated but not destroyed. The physical scars, burned temples, toppled statues, and collapsed gates were visible to all who entered. Yet the deeper wounds were political and spiritual. The loss of the sacred statues of Marduk and other deities to Elamite captivity was more than symbolic. It was a rupture in the very relationship between Babylon and its gods. In Mesopotamian thought, the physical presence of the deity's image was the embodiment of divine favor. Without it, a city was seen as abandoned by the heavens. Restoring that connection became a central mission for those who sought to revive Babylon's fortunes. The first to attempt this were native Babylonian rulers from the so-called Second Dynasty of Isin, who presented themselves as restorers of order. They reclaimed some lands lost to Elam, fortified the city walls, and initiated temple reconstruction projects. Inscriptions from this period describe these kings as humble servants of the gods, determined to bring the stolen statues back. Yet political fragmentation persisted. To the north, Assyria's star was rising rapidly. From their fortified city of Ashur, the Assyrians had mastered the art of disciplined, relentless expansion. They deployed a professional military force, adept at siegecraft and rapid campaigns, and were beginning to test their strength against Babylon's weakened state. Relations between the two powers swung unpredictably between alliances sealed by royal marriages and wars sparked by territorial disputes. To the east, Elam remained a potent rival, its influence reaching deep into the floodplains. Elamite kings, emboldened by their earlier victory, occasionally launched raids into Babylonian territory, forcing Babylon's rulers into costly defensive measures. The southern marshlands, too, proved unruly, sheltering semi-independent communities resistant to centralized authority. Culturally, however, Babylon's light did not dim. The scribal schools continued to copy and refine works of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. Astronomical observations were meticulously recorded, and advances in mathematics persisted. Even in political weakness, the intellectual prestige of Babylon remained unchallenged. Pilgrims still came to visit its temples, traders still sought its markets, and scholars still looked to it as a center of wisdom. This resilience lay in part in the religious pull of the city. The cult of Marduk, temporarily diminished, was carefully revived. Temple workshops produced new votive offerings, processional routes were repaired, and festivals reinstated. These efforts were not merely ceremonial, they were acts of political strategy, binding the city's identity once again to divine approval. By the close of the 11th century BCE, Babylon was navigating a delicate balance. Its leaders had restored a measure of dignity, but remained vulnerable to the ambitions of its neighbors. The stage was set for centuries of rivalry with Assyria, a rivalry that bring both destruction and, in unexpected turns, renewal. Babylon's fate would hinge on its ability to survive as both a city of gods and a player in the fierce, shifting politics of the ancient Near East. The long and uneasy rivalry between Babylon and Assyria entered a decisive phase in the early 1st millennium BCE, when the ambitions of the northern kings could no longer be contained by diplomacy or temporary alliances. The Assyrians, under rulers such as Tiglath-Pileser I, expanded aggressively, pushing their borders deep into Mesopotamia and beyond, mastering military logistics on a scale few had seen before. Their armies moved swiftly along well-maintained roads, bringing with them not just soldiers, but engineers, siege specialists, and administrators ready to absorb conquered territories into the Assyrian system. For Babylon, this was both a threat and, paradoxically, an opportunity. At times, Babylonian rulers sought Assyrian support against Elamite incursions or internal rebellions, accepting the political cost of acknowledging Assyrian supremacy in exchange for survival. These arrangements were unstable, breaking apart whenever one side sensed weakness in the other. In this period, Babylon's internal politics remained fragile. The second dynasty of Isin gave way to a succession of short-lived dynasties, each claiming divine sanction yet struggling to assert lasting control. Palace intrigues, shifting alliances among noble families, and the perennial challenge of managing distant territories kept Babylonian kings preoccupied. Despite the political turbulence, Babylon's cultural life retained its brilliance. The city's scribes continued to preserve and adapt ancient literary works, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Enuma Elish creation myth. Astronomers tracked the movements of planets with a precision unmatched in the ancient world, while temple musicians and poets sustained the great festivals that defined the city's religious calendar. These traditions formed the backbone of Babylonian identity, a reminder that while political power might shift, the city's role as a cultural and spiritual center remained. Assyria, however, was relentless. By the 9th century BCE, kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III had transformed Assyria into the dominant power of the region, boasting an empire that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. Babylon, proud but militarily weaker, was forced into a position of wary subordination, alternately resisting and accommodating Assyrian demands. Yet Assyrian control over Babylon was never absolute. The city's religious prestige, anchored in the cult of Marduk, meant that even Assyrian kings had to tread carefully. To rule Babylon without its people's spiritual acceptance was to invite rebellion. Some Assyrian rulers, recognizing this, took the title King of Babylon, alongside their other honors, participating in Babylonian rituals to legitimize their authority. Others ruled more harshly, provoking uprisings that flared unpredictably. It was in this context that the cycles of conquest, revolt, and uneasy peace became the rhythm of Babylon's existence. Each generation experienced moments of revival followed by renewed subjugation, as if the city itself were caught in a cosmic struggle between its own enduring identity and the overwhelming force of Assyrian expansion. This delicate dance would continue for decades, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in Mesopotamian history, a moment when Babylon, long overshadowed, would rise again to challenge and even surpass its northern rival. The final centuries of Mesopotamian independence before the rise of foreign empires were marked by one of the most remarkable transformations in Babylon's long history: the emergence of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. For generations, the city had lived under the shadow of Assyria, alternately resisting and accommodating its power. But the late 7th century BCE brought a seismic change. Assyria, overextended by constant warfare and internal strain, began to weaken. Its great cities, Nineveh and Ashur, faced uprisings from subject peoples and attacks from powerful coalitions. Among these were the Chaldeans, a Semitic tribal confederation from southern Babylonia, who had long been a disruptive but underestimated force. One of their leaders, Nabopolassar, seized the moment. Around 626 BCE, he led a revolt against the Assyrian yoke, rallying not only the Chaldeans but also disaffected Babylonians, Medes from the Iranian plateau, and other allies who saw an opportunity to end Assyrian dominance once and for all. The war that followed was fierce and relentless. Babylonian chronicles describe sieges, pitched battles, and the systematic dismantling of Assyrian power. In 612 BCE, the combined forces of Babylon and its allies captured and destroyed Nineveh, the jewel of the Assyrian Empire. The fall of that city sent shockwaves across the ancient Near East, ending centuries of Assyrian supremacy and leaving Babylon poised to take its place. Nabopolassar's reign laid the foundations for what would become a golden age under his son Nebuchadnezzar II. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was transformed into the largest and most magnificent city of its time. Massive double walls encircled the city, adorned with glazed brick reliefs in brilliant blues and golds. The Ishtar Gate, with its processional way lined by images of lions, dragons, and bulls, became a symbol of Babylon's grandeur. The city's temples, especially the great Esagila dedicated to Marduk, were restored and expanded to a scale that inspired awe in all who saw them. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was not just an architectural wonder, it was the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. The king's military campaigns secured trade routes, brought wealth and tribute, and solidified Babylon's position as the supreme power of the Near East. Yet his reign was also marked by the complexities of imperial rule, deportations of conquered peoples, including the famous exile of the Jews to Babylon, and the careful management of a diverse and multi-ethnic population. Culturally, the Neo-Babylonian period revived and expanded upon the traditions of earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. Scholars continued to study and copy ancient texts, astronomers refined their observations, and artisans perfected the craft of glazed brickwork, weaving, and metalwork. Babylon once again became the nexus, where the old wisdom of Sumer and Akkad met the currents of new ideas from across the empire. But even this golden age was not immune to the forces of change. Within a few decades of Nebuchadnezzar's death, internal strife, weak rulers, and the rising power of Persia under Cyrus the Great brought Babylon's independence to an end. In 539 BCE, the city fell without a battle to the Persians, ushering in a new chapter as part of a far greater empire. Yet the memory of Babylon's last great flourishing endured for millennia in biblical texts, in Greek histories, and in the ruins that still stand as silent witnesses to the city's greatness.